In some cases in Germany, I do feel that I will not be accepted as a German. In some communities, in some areas, you feel that I will not be seen as a German. But if you ask whether I'm a part of this country or not, sure, of course, I am a part of this country after so many years.
I'm Colin Cole.
And I'm Heather Villanueva.
And this is The Future of Our Former Democracy, a podcast from More Equitable Democracy. Throughout this season, we've explored the context of Germany's mixed-member proportional electoral system and how it rose from the ashes of fascism to become a relatively strong and stable parliamentary democracy that sees really high voter participation.
But we've also learned about the recent resurgence of far-right extremism in the form of Germany's AfD party. Though they are not part of a governing coalition in parliament, they are now the second most popular party with 20% of the seats.
The AfD ran a hardline anti-immigration campaign that aimed to pull the center-right further to the extremes, sort of like recent politics here in the U.S.
And yet, when I think about comparing and contrasting our countries, I keep thinking of Germany as pretty fundamentally different than the United States. I'm Filipino-American, I was raised in an immigrant family, and I'm acutely aware of how diverse our country is.
And I think that's how it's taught, because that's who writes our history books.
A lot of people in the U.S., because of the way that we've learned history, think of Germans as predominantly white and German-speaking.
And actually, there's also a lot of German people who tend to think of a certain type of person as, quote, truly German, or as a, quote, real German. But like we've said before, Germany is actually a lot more diverse than folks might think.
In the 90s, German politicians publicly stated Germany was not an immigration country. They always made a point of that. Germany is not an immigration country. Today, though, the reality is different.
That's journalist and author Hui Pham. She's a first-generation Vietnamese-German living in Berlin, and she spoke to our group just after Germany's February federal elections about the issues of identity and belonging.
Almost 1 in 3 people living here come from an immigrant family. And the number's even higher in big cities like Frankfurt or Berlin. And the country is actually very multicultural. You have it in public life. You can see it when you turn on the TV. There are a lot of anchors now with an immigrant background. Although still it's less than in the US. We're still not as in positions of visibility, in positions of power. We're certainly not as diverse as the whole population is.
What Hui says about Germany diversifying is backed up by data. I was surprised to learn that, according to Statista, the number of, quote, foreigners living in Germany has tripled over the past 30 years, from a little over 5 million people in 1990 to about 14 million today. That word foreigner can sound a bit loaded to listeners in the U.S., but it comes from the German Constitution and their definition of citizenship. So these include stateless persons as well and people with a migration background.
And we need to name here that the concept of race has different meaning, context, and baggage in Germany than it does here in the U.S. There are, of course, similarities, but academics have argued that Germans might actually be confused by the way we talk about race and ethnic identity. And it would make much more sense to some Germans to instead talk about heritage cultural identity. There's a link to a study that talks more about that in our show notes.
So Germans think much more about cultural identity, where people or their parents come from. And yet we also know, of course, that white supremacy and racism are a global phenomena. I'm not surprised that across the ocean, Asian people, people of color, and migrant people have similar experiences living within a white-dominant culture. Nevertheless, the actual structures of how the country deals with race and migration are a little bit different. So it's just important for us to keep that in mind and not try to directly port our American sensibilities of how race works directly into the German context. So thinking about heritage, cultural identity, the way Germans think about that concept is really important as we listen to this episode. We're talking about democracy. And as we evaluate if mixed member proportional representation is working in Germany, I think it's so vital to hear from some of those folks who belong to ethnic minorities and people with a migration background about whether or not they feel represented and how it feels to be politically scapegoated.
This election campaign has been very jarring to a lot of people on the left and to a lot of people from the immigrant community.
So here's how Hui was feeling just after that February election.
They're vexed by the whole campaign by many parties, which has focused so much on immigration and looking at immigration mainly from the perspective of security and immigration being, like, to them, a metaphor for crime, for violence, for disorder. There's a lot of Islamophobia as well. And Friedrich Merz has, in many ways, has copied the rhetoric of the far-right AfD. But also the other parties, the SPD and the Green parties, they've jumped a bit on that bandwagon, also speaking a lot about deportations. So actually, I did not feel represented in this election campaign. I was not happy with the main candidates.
I'm very looking forward to do my first vote.
That's Hashem Wadamani. He's a refugee from Syria who fled the Assad regime a decade ago. He made his way to Germany and finally got his citizenship, and thus the right to vote, shortly before this last election. I asked him what he wished German voters knew about Syrian refugees like him.
Yeah, like really makes me angry that they think of them like these monsters, that they invading them and they don't share their values. And they really, like in Syria's case, everyone here because they fled Assad and ISIS. So first, like, they hate radical Islam, and that's one of the reasons that they fled. They also fled the Assad dictatorship because they are pro-democracy. Yeah, it hurts me that they never see that they actually share most of these values, but they're not getting the support needed. Diversity is something very beautiful and we can enjoy it. So it's crazy that there's this narrative of sending away migrants, closing the doors. It's like, what are you trying to achieve here?
So ironic, right? Hisham is saying that many Syrians like him were fleeing ISIS, seeking democracy. And the far right in Germany is treating them like they are all quote-unquote terrorists.
And obviously that complicates how some migrants and refugees in Germany feel about their representation in government.
Yes, by some of them I feel myself represented.
Dr. Yasser Aydin spoke on a panel about German elections and minority representation, specifically talking about the experience of Turkish Germans. I asked him if he felt represented by parliament as a member of the Turkish German community. And he sounded more positive about the ousted Chancellor Scholz than Germany's new leader, Friedrich Merz.
For example, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, he made big efforts to speak to Turks, to talk to them, to the Turkish media, and to address them. By others, I don't have this feeling. For example, by AfD or by CDU leader, I didn't have this feeling that he wants also represent me as a German with Turkish background.
Still, Dr. Aydin saw positive signs in the number of Turkish Germans with seats in the new government.
In this new parliament, there is 19 people with Turkish backgrounds. It's a good representation if we consider that there is only 1.2 million people with Turkish background who are eligible to vote, and not all of them goes to voting. If you look at that, then we would say it's a great 19 person in the parliament with Turkish background is good thing.
I definitely want to talk more about that, especially because people with a Turkish migrant background are the largest ethnic minority in Germany. When we talk about representative democracy, we aren't necessarily talking about a one-to-one ratio of the population to their elected officials. We're not just saying Turkish people need to be represented by Turkish people, or in the US that Filipinos need to be represented by Filipinos. As we know, skinfolk ain't necessarily kinfolk. Just because we share a skin color doesn't mean that we share political ideology or that we agree on certain or most policies. Sometimes ethnic background, cultural background, language do align, but not always. But it's important that people feel heard or truly represented by their leaders and their government. This can be a real challenge for smaller minority groups.
Right. One thing folks often get wrong about, say, Voting Rights Act enforcement here in the U.S. is that they think it's about the race of the candidates getting elected. But that's not actually what the Voting Rights Act is about. What the Voting Rights Act is about is the race of the voters who are electing candidates. Better electoral systems are, as we talked about, they're not a silver bullet. They're part of a solution, but there are a lot of other things that go into how well a voting system works. Like, let's say you have the best, most fair voting system in the world, and you have the U.S. Constitution as it was written, and only wealthy, white, property-owning men are able to vote. Like, is that going to produce good outcomes? Probably not. The policies passed by that government are really only going to be responsive to the needs and wants of wealthy, white, property-owning men.
And what about the rest of us?
Exactly. And it's especially challenging when there are other barriers to even participating as a voter. Germany is not immune to this. Dr. Aydin pointed out that there's relatively low turnout among Turkish Germans. So I asked him about Germany's proportional representation system overall.
I'm the opinion that proportional system is a good thing, especially for small groups, for minority groups, and even for the migrants. Is it a good thing? Otherwise, it would benefit only big parties who would take all the constituencies, who would take the direct candidates, direct mandates, and other parties would have no chance. Without a proportional system, we would have a two-party system in Germany.
Dr. Aydin makes a great point there, and it's one of the reasons that we at More Equitable Democracy are so in favor of making democracy more proportionally representative. We know that our two-party system in the U.S. is not serving us.
A majority of Americans, Democrats, independents, and Republicans, say that they think we need a third party, a major third party, because they're just not satisfied with the two choices. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because since most elections in the U.S. aren't competitive, you know in advance if a Democrat or Republican is going to win, on Election Day, if you're a Democrat or a Republican, you kind of have the sense that your vote doesn't matter because you already know who's going to win. And so Election Day becomes a sort of rubber stamp. And if elections aren't really doing anything, then what are they for? And that's kind of the magic of proportional representation, is it makes Election Day matter again.
Yeah, it's not only about having more choices and forcing parties to compromise, which is also great, but it's about smaller groups having meaningful voting power, that pockets of the population have real self-determination, and that we are working towards a future that all people of all races have a say in the everyday issues that affect us, and that we can't be taken for granted or functionally ignored by a two-party system or by two parties that are ruled by the majority of any population in a certain geography.
And yet, while Dr. Aydin is an overall fan of Germany's electoral system, we can't forget how in this most recent election cycle, and in many others, migrants and refugees are used as political scapegoats to stoke reactionary fear and anger in voters, just like it is here.
The co-leader of Germany's far-right AfD party is calling on the government to step up deportations to Syria. Speaking to the public German broadcaster ARD, Alice Weidel accused the Chancellor Friedrich Merz of failing to act on migration. In the election campaign earlier this year, Merz had promised to curb irregular immigration and significantly increase deportations. The AfD is now the biggest opposition party in parliament.
AfD leader Alice Weidel embraced the term re-migration and pushed for mass deportation of migrants across Germany. Remigration is a buzzword among Europe's far right, and it's a euphemism for overtly racist deportation policies. The language that the AfD party was using to vilify immigrants and refugees was appalling. They just have no shame and are not trying to hide the fact that they don't like immigrants, they don't like Muslims, and they want them out of their country.
Right, they're not using dog whistle politics, they're using bullhorn politics.
They have a clear purpose to dehumanize people with immigration backgrounds, and that kind of language just pulled other parties further to the right and made it more acceptable to talk about cracking down on immigration and crime and closing borders and ramping up deportations.
And these political tactics aren't just for the news, they're working to some extent. Germany is rapidly diversifying, and this political backlash is catering to social backlash or stoking social backlash. There are a number of white Germans who want to keep their country white, who want to keep their country German-speaking. And politicians have been capitalizing on that, stoking that fire and trying to protect what they think it means to be German. So while I was over there, I asked several folks about this notion of belonging, such as Berlin-based Turkish-born tour guide Hashim Manik. He's lived in Germany for decades and grew up in Kreuzberg, a neighborhood known as Little Istanbul because of its large Turkish population. Do you feel like a German?
It's a very difficult question. I think I have both feelings. Say, I'm from Kreuzberg, so there is something in me which is German. But on the other hand, I have the Turkish roots, and I do also feel Turkish. It is not so easy to describe this, but a Turkish German or German Turk is maybe something new in that country. And there are thousands and thousands of people who are similar like me, who are German, but also Turkish. Or for some people, no German, nor Turkish.
Yeah.
And having both identities or feelings inside, especially when I'm back in Turkey, people say you are Almancı, meaning you are from Germany or you're German. And in some cases in Germany, I do feel that I will not be seen as a German.
Hashim works as a tour guide and also a translator. The German government will pay him to translate for Turkish-speaking people at doctor visits, appointments, that sort of thing. He took me and the podcast team for a tour of Kreuzberg, the Berlin neighborhood he grew up in.
Kreuzberg was, during the Cold War, next to the wall. So it was a kind of a suburb of the city in the west. This is why when Turkish people have arrived to come to Berlin, they were allowed to live in Kreuzberg. And that was official. The mayor of the city of West Berlin declared that the Turkish people, or let's say the guest workers, can only live in certain districts like Kreuzberg. So this is why, especially in the 70s, when the Turks were damned, let's say, to live only in Kreuzberg, the very first inhabitants of these houses were Turks. So look at, and still they are, look at the balconies. You see the satellite antennas.
Yeah.
So they are for Turkish television.
Yeah.
And we're, I hope, going to park next to the mosque. This is one of the very first mosques that was built by the Turkish community who arrived after the 60s. It is not the very first mosque of the town, but it was built with the donations of these people who were living around here.
Kreuzberg was the epicenter of Turkish migration in the 1950s and 60s, after the West German government invited Turks under a guest worker program to help them rebuild Berlin in the decades after World War II. Many of those guest workers ended up able to stay, became permanent residents, and raised new generations of German Turks. The neighborhood's full of Turkish-owned businesses, mosques, doner kebab restaurants, and Turkish coffee shops, like the one I sat down in with Hashim to have this conversation.
And as we've said, German Turks make up Germany's largest immigrant group.
Yeah, and it's a little complicated to study because Germany doesn't actually allow citizens to self-declare their identity. So official census data doesn't show ethnicity, but rather background on where a person was born. So according to a 2023 estimate, about 3 million people living in Germany have a migration background from Turkey. But that could be first or second generation German Turks.
Okay, and Germany has about 83 million people living in it. That means that roughly 3 to 4% of people living in Germany have a Turkish migration background, right? That's certainly a minority, but it's a large one. Leading up to the 2025 election, there was so much political discourse around immigration. And with the far-right AfD party being openly hostile and racist to immigrants and to migrants, how is Hashim feeling?
Well, I asked him just that. Do you feel welcome?
In this district where I live, mostly yes. I can say the number of the people in Germany who welcome me or people like me, still more than who are not.
The AfD is obviously significantly more popular in other parts of the country, especially more in the East. Do you think you would feel comfortable or welcome spending much time out in those parts of Germany?
If I don't have to, I do not like to or plan to travel to these parts of Germany.
Yeah, you know, that sounds awfully familiar. I kind of know that feeling. Now, when it comes to politics, it's interesting to note that Hashim is part of the largest minority group in Germany. But this group doesn't have a fully proportional share of seats in parliament, and their overall voting rates remain relatively low. Unlike the United States, Germany does not have birthright citizenship. So that means the kids of those first-generation guest workers born in Germany don't necessarily have the right to vote.
Another big part of that issue is that up until very recently, Germany didn't even allow for dual citizenship. So for many Turks who felt it was important to keep their Turkish citizenship, even though they lived in Germany, they didn't really have an option. So that was a group of people disproportionately not able to vote. And that's true for Hashim, who up until recently would have had to give up his Turkish passport if he wanted to gain German citizenship, even though he's lived there for over 30 years.
And there can be a language barrier for potential voters.
There is no bilingual ballot, first of all.
That's Dr. Yasser Aydin again, who, by the way, is a sociology and economics professor and a researcher with a focus on Turkish migration and integration. He said that despite efforts by Turkish German organizations to get out the vote in 2021, they saw little effect.
Participation of Turks was in the elections 2021 around 20%, very low in Germany. This time we had a 84% election participation for all Germany, but I don't have exact data, exact statistic for the last.
I'm struck that participation of folks with migrant backgrounds is an issue in Germany because it's also an issue in the U.S. that voter participation for immigrants in the U.S. is also quite low. Struck but not surprised, because obviously people who are new to a country, who are becoming integrated into the civic life, need some sort of on-ramp and education in order to be able to feel comfortable to participate. And that can also be a multi-generational issue, not just for new arrivals.
That's what we see in Germany with the Turkish Germans. A lot of the folks who have held on to their Turkish citizenship and not applied for German citizenship are second and third generation Germans. So it's actually a bit difficult to find official data on the number of German Turks who voted in the last election, so we have to rely mostly on exit polling. But we do know that, according to German newspaper DW, there remains a diversity gap in the new parliament. While 30% of people living in Germany, and about 14% of the electorate, have an immigrant background, the same does not go for the Bundestag. Only 73 of the 630 representatives have non-German roots. That's only 11.6% of lawmakers.
All right, and on the other hand, due to the complicated process of obtaining German citizenship, only about 14% of Germans with migration backgrounds can vote. So having about 11% representation is not too bad.
And when we're thinking about our comparative politics here with the U.S., even if we were going with that higher number of 30%, 1/3 of folks with migrant backgrounds being represented is quite a bit better than we're doing here with what we see in the U.S. Congress and our state representatives. Mm-hmm. So this all sort of goes back to that tricky issue of how proportional representation isn't always evaluated by its one-to-one demographic reflectiveness, that we are more complex than our ethnic backgrounds or the countries that we or our parents were born in. Rather, we know proportional representation is effective when the interests of the electorate overall are represented by a diversity of parties and policies and elected officials who represent them.
As a side note, Germany actually does recognize one minority group officially to give them a seat in parliament despite not reaching the 5% threshold. They are the South Schleswig Voters Association, the SSW, who represent Germany's Danish minority.
Turks are not formally a minority group. They are a migrant group, but they don't have this minority status like you mentioned, the Danish minority in the Schleswig-Holstein, in the northern part of Germany. They sent one person to Bundestag. The Serbs not this time, no.
This time not.
But Turks doesn't have this status. But there is a Turkish party, Dava. Dava. They didn't participate in the Bundestagswahl, in the Bundestag's elections, but they will participate in the election in Hamburg.
So as Dr. Aydin says, there is a party that represents Turkish Germans in local state-level elections. However, they are not yet able to gain party seats at the federal level.
But the problem is, Dava is a very small group coming from the political Islam, from the Milli Görüş movement and so on. They are not able to mobilize Turks or Greek. If we would in Germany have a good organized party with clever, smart politicians, they can do it.
DAWA, or the Democratic Alliance for Diversity and Awakening, is a very new party. They were introduced in January of 2024 and haven't yet had time to garner significant political impact. DAWA got just 0.31% of the vote in that March Hamburg state election and failed to gain any seats there. But as Dr. Aydin said, the political system does allow for Turks to gain some political representation with just a little bit of clever politics. And that's an opportunity that wouldn't really exist under a winner-take-all system. And the fact that folks are running for office at all under a political party is sort of the first step. We know from decades of election research that in the United States, if you're a first-time candidate, you often don't win. But when you run again and again and you build name recognition for you or your community group or your party, that's when you can start making gains. All that to say, Turkish Germans running campaigns that are explicitly trying to appeal to the Turkish German community is something new. And even though they're not winning elections yet, that doesn't mean it's not meaningful. And it actually might be the first step in gaining more representation.
We see that democracy is a constant project, and the electoral system can be limiting or it can be enabling in some cases. Germany uses a mixed member proportional election system, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect. It's going to take time using any system to see changes in representation over time. What we've seen in the US with our winner-take-all system is that it's replicating division, it's replicating racism, it's limiting representation over and over and over again.
It's probably fair to say that no matter what, you have to overcome systemic bias, oppression, just inertia. And like you said, in winner-take-all systems, those are harder forces to overcome. They're not totally inert under proportional systems, but you have to do less work to begin to chip away at them.
Which is why you have to actually dismantle systems of oppression on purpose. So how does this work in Germany? We know that the members of the Bundestag are still mostly older white men.
The proportion of elected officials lags behind the electorate for age, gender, and migrant background. On the other hand, the percentage of members of parliament with a migration background has been growing rapidly. It's almost doubled since 2013. So things are catching up with regards to demographics change. So the actual representation of people in Germany's elected government is catching up to the diversifying demographics in terms of ethnic and migration background. Now, we're going to talk a few numbers here, and I guess I want to say two things at the top. One, Germany's system is certainly not perfect, and it does have problems in terms of people who are underrepresented that will be very familiar to us in the US. And at the same time, almost every time Germany has a problem, the equivalent problem is worse where we live.
Let's talk about gender inequality in Germany. In the Bundestag, the share of women is about a third, even though we know that women make up like half the population. Mm-hmm. So if you do the math, another 115 members of parliament who are women would need to be elected in order to reach gender parity, if straight representation is the goal.
Now, German law doesn't require this, but some political parties in Germany have opted into gender quotas to ensure that they're sending some women to the Bundestag. But most of them aren't sending equal numbers of men and women. And predictably, there's a lot less gender equity, especially among the further right parties.
And gender quotas, again, just to put a finer point on it, is reserving certain seats for women.
Right. Basically, a political party might say half of every person that are elected from our party will be women. And then on their party list, that second vote, they can just actually alternate man, woman in terms of who's listed.
To bring a bit of perspective here, I'm reminded that we never set out to say that Germany has a perfect system. Democracy is messy. It will always be messy. It is actually supposed to be messy. And justice and equality are still things that every country can strive for and must struggle for. But voters in Germany have many more choices of who represents them, and they are not burdened by the false dichotomies of a two-party winner-take-all system like we are.
By way of comparison, here at home, the current Congress, the 119th Congress, is the most racially and ethnically diverse to date. Hooray! And that's because just over 1/4 of voting members in the U.S. Congress are non-white. And yet the country is almost 50% non-white. It's about 43% people of color. And we're actually on pace to become a majority people of color nation. So there's a huge representation gap there. The House and Senate this year are both less than 30% women. So again, there's a representation gap here as well. And it's arguably a worse one than what we see in Germany.
And a two-party system allows the two parties to just ignore smaller, even though they may be important minorities, because all they need is 50% plus one. Overall, it does seem like Germany is better situated to represent minority voters, even though it has a ways to go. But representation doesn't necessarily solve racism.
And I guess part of why we fight for democracy is so that it can be a system where issues are honestly debated and worked on for all people, regardless of their backgrounds or their personal views. That if you have an opinion and enough other people agree with you, that opinion will be represented.
Even racists should get the right to vote, though they should not have a disproportionate amount of power over any other group.
Right. If 20% of the population are racists and they get 20% of the seats, that sucks, but it's democracy.
But then they could be in conversation with most likely the majority of us who actually don't believe that brown people are bad.
Right. The problem is when that 20% of the voters who are super racist are able to take over one of two political parties, and then suddenly they're 55% of the legislature, even though they're less than 1 in 5 voters. So talking about this grappling of representation, what can we do that is better than we do today? What are the limits on it? What don't better systems address? I want to return to Vietnamese-German author and journalist Hui Pham because she spoke to these challenges that she faces as a first-generation child of immigrants in Germany.
I identify as Vietnamese-German. I identify as a hyphenated person. I grew up in Germany, speaking language perfectly, having a German passport, but still always being asked where I was from. So it gave me a sense that I did not really belong here. I was not fully accepted the way I was. And I think that this early feeling of somehow not quite fitting into the society has stayed with me until today, which is why I would call myself a new German or Vietnamese-German much rather than a German. When I was growing up in the 90s, I think the question I was probably asked most often was the question of, where are you from? And then I would always say, I'm from Berlin, because that's the place where I was born. I had always had German citizenship. I speak German so much better than Vietnamese. My Vietnamese is really crap. But at that time, in the 90s, people did not understand that you could be German, but not be white.
Hui grew up in Germany speaking German, and I grew up in the US speaking English. The issue of language, passing on language, what it means to fit in, to assimilate, to belong, and to succeed in the United States are issues that immigrants grapple in both in Germany and in the US. I only grew up speaking English. even though my parents speak 4 Filipino languages. And that's because in the 80s, a lot of Filipino parents were told, just speak one language to your kids because it will confuse them, which is totally ridiculous. And sometimes it's to succeed. And a lot of us immigrant kids blame our parents, but what's really at fault here is the whole system of oppression that's telling us that there's only one way to be American. Or in Germany, there's only one way to be German. And it affected me so much to grow up and be monolingual and not understand the things that were being told at my family potlucks or hear firsthand stories that are supposed to be passed on from generation to generation from my parents or my aunties and uncles or from my grandparents. The fact that I couldn't hear that in their native language and all the nuances and culture that is transmitted when you say something in a native language and hear something in the native language, that has been a huge loss for me. But that is actually the intent of colonization. That is on purpose. So much to the effect that, I've designed my life in a way that I could reclaim language. So now I'm not monolingual. I actually had the incredible opportunity to go on sabbatical and reclaim my parents' languages, Pangasinan, Ilocano, and Tagalog, and study in the Philippines. For migrants living in Germany, there's a huge pressure to learn German. It's necessary if you want to gain citizenship and the right to vote. You have to pass a German test in order to become a citizen. As Hui said, that pressure to learn German can lead to parents not teaching their kids their own native language.
And that's exactly the kind of thing that Hui experienced, and something that she wrote about in her novel Brothers and Ghosts, which draws on those threads of othering and belonging as a hyphenated person. Hui was born in West Germany, just 7 years before the Berlin Wall fell, and she's part of a relatively small minority group in Germany. There's about 215,000 people with Vietnamese origin.
It's only changing slowly right now, but for a long time, the idea is really that to be German, you have to have that biological relationship. And at that time also, when you look at official statistics, you only had the category of the German and the category of the immigrant, of the foreigner, of the Ausländer, that's the term. So at that time, people always called me an Ausländer, a foreigner, even though I was a kid who was born here. Really, if I was to describe my sense of upbringing, it's this kind of like huge sense of being misunderstood and mischaracterized. And this is something that really bothers me, like the constant push to put you into the category of the good immigrant or the bad immigrant. It gives people the feeling that they have to prove themselves to be a part of the society, that they have to achieve something. And in the case of many immigrant Germans I know, the sense that they need to work twice as hard in order to accept it.
I remember my mom telling me exactly this, that I had to work twice as hard to be accepted in the US. And so I keep thinking, like, this is a familiar story in both the US and in Germany. To have an immigrant background can basically mean that you're a political football. At the same time that I am fully a part of this country, I contribute, I pay my taxes, I interact kindly and sometimes not kindly with people, with my neighbors, like I am an American. And yet, my American neighbors, classmates, coworkers, the person that fixed my car, I don't know, do they want to vote me out of existence? There was a time when it felt like half of them did. And it's just painful.
And Hui reflected on that exact same point in Germany. Right after the election, she wrote an article in USA Today called, "Does My Country Want Me?" And Hui pointed out that, of course, given Germany's racist and fascist history, the rise of the far right is deeply unsettling, and not just in Germany, but in the US and beyond.
Germany is a very special case because it has a deep history with the far right. Germany is the country that elected Adolf Hitler and started the Second World War in the name of racial supremacy and killed 6 million people. We know what flirting with the far right, flirting with the neo-Nazis, with revisionism, racial thinking, that this can actually lead to violence and to murder and conflict. And I wish that Germany itself would take a better note of that. For a very long time, there was a social and political taboo to never again fall into the traps of fascism. And I wish that actually not just Germany, but also the States, if people would remember what happened back then. this is not just a German dark legacy, but this is something I think that should maybe speak to us all, to our global conscience. How can we let it come back? How can we let it come back? If I look at the United States now, I find it so hard to believe what's going on. When I grew up as a child, I thought the States was the way forward. I thought that this is the place where people like me, hyphenated people like me, can express themselves. They are not constantly asked where they're from, but they're actually just amongst themselves. I thought the States was more progressive than Germany. At that time it was. And now I look at the States and think, oh my God, we must not let this happen here. We must not become like them.
It sounds like the rise of the far right in both Germany and the US was really weighing hard on Hui's mind.
It may sound very crass, but in recent days, I have been wondering, we are witnessing the fallacies of Western democracy right now. We've been watching actually for a number of years, we've been watching how Western democracy is taking itself apart through its own mechanisms. Still, of course, as Churchill said, it's the best options amongst all. I don't want to live in an authoritarian system like China or Vietnam. Certainly, I don't. So I guess what we can take from this election is that obviously many people in Germany don't shy away from voting for the AfD, which counts Holocaust deniers and convicted far-right supremacists amongst their ranks. They don't shy away from that. I'm looking at the society, think maybe I underestimated. I underestimated this proportion of people. Maybe I underestimated the mistrust. And I kept thinking back to the 90s when I grew up here and had the sense that I was not really welcome. This question pops up in my mind again. Am I welcome? It makes me question what is wrong with us. It makes me question why the allure of racism is always so strong.
Why is the allure of racism so strong in Germany and in the US? I don't want to live in a country that hates me, that hates my parents, that hates my friends. But look, I am still an American to my core. I've lived my whole life here. But the country I want to live in is making progress to dismantling racism and making a future for people of color where we can fully be a part of society. It makes me feel some sort of way that a person with a migrant background, another Asian from Germany, from a formerly fascist country, is saying that she doesn't want Germany to become like the US and who we are and what we are becoming.
And I don't want to be in a country where white folks get benefits by the nature of being white. That actually ironically promotes mediocrity and it hurts people. And I want to live in a country where the people who don't want the US to be better than that, who want us to be an ethno-state, don't have the power to take over government. And right now they do. I think that's something that we can pretty definitively say in comparing the German system to the US. If you compare Germany 2024 to the United States 2016, both countries had comparable numbers of the population that held far-right xenophobic views. And one country, that 20% of the population, essentially took over government. And then the other, that 20% of the population, elected 20% of the elected officials and are still considered a radical fringe group. Look, people with far-right views are always going to exist. The question isn't how do we make them go away? The question is, how does an electoral system limit or enable that far right to take power?
I think what it comes down to is the concept of power and proportionality and disproportionality. Who in this country is allowed to have power and how much can they have? As much as we talk about proportionality, we need to talk about the disproportionate amount of power that the current power holders have. The current power holders being white, wealthy, rich men who buy into this idea that they are somehow superior because of their wealth, because of the color of their skin, because they are men. And as we're having this conversation, we do have to keep in mind that this is all relative. As we are comparing and contrasting democracies and criticizing, critiquing, and trying to make these systems better, we understand that we live in a world where there are folks who don't even get to enjoy these flawed systems, these flawed freedoms.
My name is Hisham Abdamani. I'm from Syria, and I moved to Germany around 10 years ago. And now I work at Bard College Berlin, and my job title is Civic Engagement Coordinator.
I was following Germany's elections from afar, and it seems like the newer immigrants and refugees from Muslim countries like Syria are often those that are the most scapegoated by politicians or threatened with deportation.
Hisham spoke to our group as part of a panel of refugees that were sharing their experiences living in Germany and their thoughts about the election. But I first met up with him in a bustling coffee shop just a few days earlier.
We are in a neighborhood called Pankow in this Stück von Glück, a piece of luck cafe. Yeah, and we're setting up for this interesting podcast.
Hisham shared a pretty amazing story. Again, he fled his home to escape the brutalities of the Assad regime after the crackdowns following the pro-democracy movement of the Syrian Revolution, the Arab Spring of 2011. Hisham actually fled and returned home to Syria a couple of times, but ultimately he escaped in 2015 by bribing officials in Jordan to get his passport back, flying to Turkey, and then swimming 8 kilometers across the open ocean to Greece. He then walked all the way to Germany to seek asylum status. At the time, then Chancellor Angela Merkel made huge waves by passing policies welcoming those escaping from conflict 10 years ago. She famously said, "Wir schaffen das." Basically, we can manage this. We can handle this. We can accept refugees without it breaking the bank, without it hurting the lives of Germans. In the last 10 years, though, a lot has changed, and his new home has not always felt welcoming. Syrians like Hisham have faced a lot of political pushback ever since those policies were passed.
Yeah, so I arrived in Germany in the summer of 2015 with that large wave of exodus hitting Germany. And of course, that shaped the politics of Germany ever since. And now it is still the dominating topic. It's not like the ultimate dream to live in exile or be seen as a threat to a hosting country, and you're despised and you're the main agenda of an election to be deported.
It was a hugely complex ordeal for Hisham to even just get settled and to navigate the new system he was living in.
First, you arrive with tons of energy and you're very excited to start a new life, fresh start. Super looking forward to start anew, contribute to the society, thanking them for letting us shelter here. But of course, you get slapped soon with the bureaucracy and navigating super complex bureaucratic system that is even not easy for German. Here, they're very known for their bureaucracy. And yeah, you have to deal with tons of paper in a different language. They expect you to be fluent in the language from day one. So it was mostly trying to navigate through.
Can you imagine? Hisham is just one of millions of refugees and migrants in Germany that have to try to navigate this process if they want to become full German citizens and have the right to vote. It's a lot of bureaucracy for someone who speaks the language and for someone who's new to it.
And Hisham is a special case in that he was persistent enough to keep trying until he became a German citizen. Many people, especially Turks, Syrians, and others, just keep living in Germany as permanent residents, but without the benefit of citizenship or the right to vote. Like the US, Germany does not make it particularly easy to become a citizen. And so you have to really, really want it to do it. And you have to become fluent in German to do it.
I got connected with Bard College Berlin, and I was given a full cover scholarship to continue my education here. It was in law. I did a degree in ethics and politics, or that was my major. I enjoyed those 4 years studying. And then later I took different jobs. I improved my German. And until I was ready to submit my citizenship application to the authorities. It took only 3 years for them to do the application. So that gives you an idea of bureaucracy here. And yeah, I was given the German citizenship the same day almost I'm not sure if I can call it the success of the Syrian revolution, but it was the same week toppling the Assad regime. And that was a crazy coincidence. But then also Germany will have an early election. So in 1 week, toward the end of February 2025. And it will be my first time ever voting.
Even just listening back to this again, I'm just so warmed by Hesham as a human being. Just what an incredible story he has. And what an incredible person he is. After all those years and all those struggles, just the poetry of him getting his citizenship the day the dictatorship is toppled, and talking to him just days before these snap elections.
Wow. After being a part of the uprising that was supposed to bring democracy to Syria, having to flee his homeland, and then navigate the complexities of gaining German citizenship, 10 years later, Hesham was finally able to vote for the first time in his life. And in an election that talked so much about refugees and asylum seekers just like him.
And naturally, I had to ask him about that. Being a democracy nerd, a lot about the process itself, but also, now that he was a voter, just how he was thinking about the election. What does it feel like to be a first-time voter in Germany?
Feels like doing high school that you have to prepare for. Yeah, so it feels not an easy task with so much changing political landscape. Now, when I want to vote, I'm not gonna just think about migration. It's one, but also there are other parts. It's getting me crazy, like how, like the migration discourse is dominating the elections. Are you thinking about data privacy, big tech, taxes of the rich versus the poor, leaving NATO, what these mean, etc., etc.? But yeah, the focus only on migration and not necessarily in a good way. So yeah, suddenly I became German 1 month ahead of the election. And now I have to recap myself on all of the party's program and who to vote for.
As cynical as I can feel about elections and politics, I do feel some hope when I listen to Hesham. He struggled so hard to get the right to vote and to get the right to live safely. If he can do it, there must be some hope for us continuing this hard work of reforming our own political system, of pushing back against anti-democratic forces, or of getting better representation for marginalized people.
Well said. It's why we do the work that we do. With the rise of the AfD in Germany and the far right here in the US and much of the rest of Europe, understanding how we can improve our democratic systems is more vital than ever. And part of that work is helping enable more people to be able to vote and to participate, and not just to vote, but to be able to vote meaningfully, to cast a vote that matters.
The purpose of the election that we learned from the school until today is that simple people living in a country can elect some people who will take care of their interests in their daily lives in the government, to protect their interests, their rights, and include them to the social life.
For now, Hashim Anik, our Turkish German guide, cannot vote. Though, due to recent reforms, he said that he can now begin seeking dual German citizenship. But there are other organizations and efforts from groups like Wir Wollen, We Vote, to extend voting rights to all people living in the country. Their campaign, I Live Here, I Vote Here, is a campaign to extend democratic participation across Europe regardless of citizenship. And, of course, many groups are working on important election reforms right here in the United States.
On the next episode, we'll look into the future and talk about some of the developments in proportional representation campaigns here at home. We'll talk about how we can apply all the lessons we've learned from Germany to hopefully make our democracy work better for more people. Because change comes slowly, but the work continues.
The Future of Our Former Democracy is a production of More Equitable Democracy and Large Media. That's LARJ Media. Our producer-editors are Maria Paleologos and Isaac Kaplan-Woolner, with help from Corrine Kiltow. Sean Simmons engineered the show. Tina Knoll is principal and head of creative at Large Media. Fact-checking by Martin Lang. Special thanks to Faith Ambadi, George Chung, and Marty Reamer. If you like what you've heard today, please share this episode with someone you think needs to hear it. Personal recommendations are still the best way to get the word out. And of course, rate and review the show. It really does help. For links and more information on today's episode, check out the show notes at www.equitabledemocracy.org.
I'm Colin Cole.
And I'm Heather Villanueva.
My chair's too squeaky. Did you get that?
And I'm Heather Villanueva.
I'm Colin Cole.